Hello there. I'd like to welcome you to the first new season of the Circle of Wine Writers Let's Talk series. And today we're talking about the science of wine aging with Kelli White. I'd like to extend a welcome to our members who are joining for the first time and also to non-members. The Circle was founded in 1960 in the UK and today has 270 plus members, including wine writers, educators, broadcasters, and other professional communicators. The membership is now global with a split of between 50-50 between the UK and overseas. There's more information about the Circle of Wine Writers on our website and also the details there if you're interested in joining. If you'd also like to find out more information about future seminars that we have, then please do let me know via email and we'll add you to our list. I'd now like to hand you over to fellow Circle member Dominic Buckwell, who will introduce our presenter today. Over to you, Dominic.
Thank you, Liz. So welcome, everybody. My name is Dominic. I'm a member of the Circle. I have been involved with the Circle now for about 5 years. I've only been involved in wine for 10 years, but in the last year, I've helped to set up an organisation called Libération Tardive, or also known as 10 Plus Wines, to promote wines which are capable of aging to ensure that they are aged and enjoyed at the right time. Or the right times. As part of this campaign, we've had various tastings and events. So far, we've done focus on Grillet in the Rhone. We've done England. We're looking at doing an event with Liz Gabay next month about ageable rosé, and next year on Brunello. As well as tastings and dinners, we decided we wanted to do some publications. And our first commission is this one to Kelli to write about the science of wine aging. And Kelli, as most of you may know, is a very accomplished writer. She was originally a sommelier. I first came across her in the Somme film, Into the Bottle, which was, for me, quite an inspiring film to watch. Those beautiful different estates that were promoted by various sommeliers. And Kelli has written the book on Napa Valley called Then and Now. And more recently, with the Académie du Vin, she's written the book called Wine Confident, which is very much about communicating to people in jargon-free way to demystify and to explain what wine is all about. So we thought she was ideal to communicate the very knotty, difficult, challenging, complex subject of wine science and demystify it for all of them. So that is hopefully what she's going to do today. She's currently the wine educator at Meadowood Hotel in Napa Valley. That's one of the top hotels in Napa, with people visiting and presenting wines and tours and educating at that end. And she's also written a lot in terms of World of Fine Wine for Decanter in the New York Times, for Jancis Robinson. She's contributed to the World Atlas of Wine and also the Oxford Companion to Wine. So I think that's enough accolades for now, Kelli. So I'd like to hand over to you to take us through your paper on what happens when wine ages. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dominic. And thank you to the Circle of Wine Writers for having me. I'm thrilled to be here. This is a subject that is near and dear to my heart, both in my time as a wine writer, but also my time as a sommelier. So the two places I worked with those longest tenures were a restaurant called Veritas in New York City, which some of you might be aware at the time had one of the largest wine lists in the world, with wines going back 100 years and more sometimes. And then the Press restaurant in Napa Valley, which we focused on older vintages of Napa, which at the time was almost scandalous. So I love older wine and I love science. I am not a scientist. I want to make that very clear. In fact, I have phoned a friend to help me out today in case you all come at me with some penetrating scientific questions. Dr. Andrew Waterhouse is here with us. And he's graciously provided his time today. In case any of you have really specific scientific questions, I'm going to direct you to him. His amazing book, of which I have the first edition here, Understanding Wine Chemistry. You can see it's dog-eared, it's underlined, it's been beaten up because I use this all the time. It's a fabulous book. It is a technical book. But I find that you can really understand what they're talking about even without a science background. I have a science background. I went to a high school for science and math and then studied neuroscience in college, but that was a very long time ago. And so I use that to help me understand this material. But even without that, I think this book would have been accessible, but it certainly is technical. So well worth having. And the link to that is in the chat. So to dive in, I'm going to share my screen. Give me a minute while I get that going. Does that look good? Okay, great. Thumbs up. So this is something I've written about for other publications as well, although I was really honored to write about this for Libération Tardive. And this is also based on now a class that I offer at Meadowood on the same age. So this is a material that I've recycled a lot for over the course of my career, and I will talk about that more towards the end, where I included a little section on tips for technical writing. But what happens to wine as it ages is very fun topic, in part because a lot of it is not perfectly understood yet. You can imagine from a scientific perspective, even if you're not a scientist, sort of the impossibility of like true scientific studies, right? If you were going to invest in top wine, not inexpensive, and then age it yourself for decades. I mean, that's sort of already beyond the scope of most grants and certainly most careers and probably a lot of budgets, right? So there's a lot of anecdotal information, and quite frankly, there's a lot of misinformation out there that I think can be tricky to comb through. So that's why when I wrote this article for Dominic, that was then republished on jr.com, I asked Dr. Waterhouse to fact check it before I submitted it. And he caught a couple of things that I had misunderstood or misinterpreted, and he did that, for free, just generosity. And my feeling in dealing with a lot of scientists over the years, especially wine scientists, is that they like the misinformation out there even less than us writers do. And so they're really happy to participate in setting their record straight, right? Like, for example, the tongue map, which you still see everywhere, been widely debunked, right? But still persists in the greater wine conversation. So it's always important to take a little extra time to fact check, especially as a lot of publications are no longer offering that service. So enough of that. Let's talk about aging wine, right? So there's a lot of reasons to take the time and the expense and the risk to age wine. I think probably for everyone on this Zoom, it really comes down to the pleasure of tasting and drinking old wine. This is, for me, I love obviously young, fresh, fruity wine, of course. That's wonderful. But the most emotional and impactful and artistic kind of interactions I've had with wine have all been with bottles of usually some degree of age, a decade, sometimes multiple decades, sometimes more. So the pleasure of drinking old wine, those autumnal flavors, that can be enough of a motivator. I know other people that collect wine and age wine because they're attached to things that happened that year, the vintage of that wine, whether it's something from their personal lives or just something that happened in the past that they're fascinated by. People that buy old wine now on the secondary market are a little bit of a different sort of strategies, different motivations, because needless to say, as time goes on, there's less and less of a specific wine. So rarity comes into play. But also it's a risky business because, as we all know, there's a lot of things that can go wrong in a bottle of wine, and almost none of them are visible from just looking at the bottle. So big reward, but significant risk as well. So wines change dramatically. One of the things we're not going to talk about over the course of this session is, which wines necessarily age better in terms of specific types of wine, because I feel like we probably all have a sense of, the types of wines that age well. The only thing that I will say is that I have been wonderfully surprised by wines that should not have aged well. And I tell the story in my most recent book, Wine Confident, about how I misplaced a very messy garage, and I misplaced a case of Muscadet for like 7 years, dug it out, cracked a bottle open with no hope, and was just absolutely blown away by how well that wine had aged. So there's hope for, I think, even the more mundane bottles. But nonetheless, what happens, like what is physically, chemically happening in the glass and in the bottle, is complex and somewhat mysterious. So again, all of this is going to be really elementary to a lot of you, but a wine's sensory impression, right? The whole picture is both the sum of its parts and, of course, more than that. But we're going to talk about how these individual elements age, because they all age differently, right? So we're going to talk specifically about colors, aroma, alcohol, acidity, and then we're going to talk about tannin and phenolics, and we're going to gesture towards bubbles and sweetness. Color is a pretty dramatic transformation, and there's a lot of things that are going on. And I would also like to invite Dr. Waterhouse to raise his hand or unmute himself if I misspeak at any point. But my understanding is that, as a red wine is kind of fermenting, and during élevage and barrel aging, the color is kind of forming. Let's talk specifically about red wine, right? And the pigments on their own are relatively unstable, but they bind to tannins, right? And they form long and stable chains. This is how red wine kind of achieves some color stability. But these chains, right, these polymers, are constantly changing in length, in large part because even once a wine is bottled and it's sort of stabilized, because of the fact that wine is an acidic medium, right? It's always going to be exerting pressure on the bonds of the chemicals in solution. And so, but it's a gently acidic medium. So a lot of these changes happen slowly. In terms of tannin and color, these chains are constantly changing in length. Sometimes they're growing, right? And sometimes they're shrinking. This is one of the big, I would say, misconceptions of wine aging, and this is something that I've gotten wrong in the past. But as they lengthen, at some point, some of them form long enough chains that they actually drop out of solution. This then becomes the sediment or the sludge that we've all experienced, certainly in older red wines or unfined, unfiltered red wines, right? And as those things drop out of solution, that's one way in which a wine both loses its kind of youthful color, specifically the purple, blue, black pigments, and also starts to lose some of the sensation of tannin, right? So you have the decline of some pigments, but you also have the rise of others. Specifically, some brown and yellow hues can be synthesized over time. So you have some were there all along, and they're simply revealed by the decline of the brighter, more youthful pigments, and some are forming. Right, like xanthillium, for example, is forming during bottle age, and that's a yellow pigment. And then you also have caramelization and the Maillard reaction, and both of these things happen really slowly. For those that are unfamiliar, the Maillard reaction is very famous as to what happens when you cook meat, right? When it becomes brown, when you roast things and it becomes brown, right? And that's a really dramatic, fast thing, right? You apply heat, it sizzles, things turn brown. Nothing that dramatic is happening in wine. This is happening really slowly over time, but it is nonetheless happening. And it is part of the reason why wines tend to sort of brown with age. And then caramelization, this is really becomes a big deal in in sweet wines, certainly, right? Because there's just extra sugar and it's the sugars that caramelize. But even in a so-called dry wine that has no residual sugar, that doesn't taste sweet at all, there are going to be odd sugar molecules, right, in solution that can caramelize with time. And that is part of the reason why this happens to both red and white wine, right? So, what makes a wine age-worthy? The first time I ever wrote about this subject was years ago for Guildsom. And I was coming at this I like to approach these big questions with a certain degree of deliberate naivete, right? Because I find that often I get the best answers and I allow myself to be surprised rather than coming in assuming that I already know what the outcome of the piece is going to be. So I really just came in as a let's say a baby scientist. What's happening? What is the one thing that helps a wine age well? And I thought back then, if I just interviewed enough people and enough experts, that eventually some consensus would be reached. And what I found instead was actually more exciting, which was an utter lack of consensus in that, you know, all of these things are important. They all have preservative effects. Certainly alcohol is a preservative, right? Formaldehyde, we know that. High alcohol is a preservative after a certain level. We'll talk about this a little bit more in detail, but needless to say, table wines that are higher in alcohol than another table wine might actually have a lower chance of aging well, because if it's picked to the point where some premature oxidation has already started to happen or the acidity is low. So it's not a static, it's not higher alcohol is always better. There's some nuance there. Acidity is certainly important, right? If you think about cutting an apple or an avocado and you don't eat it all, the way you forestall browning is maybe by squeezing some lemon on it, right? So that's a pretty good example of acidity being a preservative or at least an antioxidant. But high acid itself is insufficient, right? Because we've certainly probably all had really unbalanced, shrill wines that offered acidity and much less else and little else. That wine is not going to age well in that it will not continue to taste delicious. So other stuff is important too. There's the stuffing of the wine. Tannin has a preservative effect, right? Certainly, but again, needs to kind of be in balance with other elements of the wine in order to be pleasurable. And I would say that's probably an important definition to start with, in that what's considered to be aging well, which is a wine that is still pleasurable and delicious and or improved on the other side of the aging arc, right? But maybe even more important than all of this are the bottle's storage conditions. Again, I'm sure everybody in this call is aware of the old adage, right? After a certain age, there's no such thing as good wine, only good bottles. The bottle storage condition is really important. You could have a wine just with all of the critical elements that should carry it gracefully into the future. And if the power goes out in a heat wave and that wine is exposed to high temperatures suddenly, it could all be for naught. So storage is paramount. And then this last one we're going to talk about too, which is a little bit more kind of woo-woo and maybe, you know, magical. But there's this idea that is hard to quantify, and yet, you know, we sort of know it when we feel it. These ideas of balance, right? Of a wine being in balance feels essential to its ability to age well, right? And again, that's hard to measure. That's sort of in some ways, a non-scientific term. Quality, certainly, and I would also add craftsmanship, right? Intention is important. So let's break down these individual things, and we've talked about some of this, but this is a lot of dense detail. You can find a lot of this text is lifted specifically from the article, so you can by all means revisit this, but this information on these slides you'll also find in the article. So alcohol is a preservative, of course, but in wine terms, we're really only talking about elevated alcohol, because you need to have it at a point where the acetobacter cannot thrive, right? And so acetobacter is the bacteria which can create high levels of what's it called, EA and volatile acidity, right? So you don't want that guy in there. He's a bad guy. So you have higher alcohol kind of forestall that. But again, lower than that, and you're talking about ripeness and picking windows and balance and things like that. So alcohol is not a binary point. There is, over time, a wine will lose both acidity and alcohol. And of course, we're talking over a long period of time, right? Decades. A wine will lose both acidity and alcohol. But on paper, they're really small changes, but they might have very, especially with acidity, kind of outsized like gustatory impressions. So there is something that happens to wine over time called esterification. And that's a really slow process where alcohol and acid react together to form an ester, right? And many of these esters are aromatic. So this is it oftentimes a source of new aromas. This is a lot of how some of the new aromas that emerge in a wine's bouquet over time comes through this process. But by virtue of creating an ester, you are removing some acidity and some alcohol from the mix. The alcohol reduces just very, very slightly. In the wine, and the acidity also very slightly, but it matters more. In fact, Dr. Waterhouse, I have a quote from him here. He said, if all of the acidity in a wine was lost via esterification, the ABV would only drop by 1%, right? So this act of esterification has a more of an effect, measurable effect on the acidity than it does on the alcohol. And the effect on the acidity is actually really quite profound because acidity shapes, in many senses, the texture of the wine, and it's universal, unlike tannins, to both white and red. So this is important. Some people have suggested, and I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself here, but tannin and pigment chains, right? They lengthen and they shorten over time. But overall, the tendency is to form shorter chains, right? And you would say that shorter chains should taste more astringent. And yet we all say all the time in all of our writing that older wines feel more smooth, right? That they're less tannic with time. Part of that textural difference might be because some of the tannin has been lost as it forms those long chains and drops out of solution. Some of it might be because those shorter tannin chains might become modified tannins and bind to other compounds in the wine that will affect our impression of their astringency and lessening the sense of astringency, but also because tannins and acidity interact in wine from a sensory perspective. Even a small drop in acidity will make a wine feel way more soft, plush, creamy, smooth. So even though this is on paper, a wine is losing precious little acidity, it's having a big impact on the flavor, on the taste of the wine, the overall impression. And another way in which acidity is lost is through the precipitation of tartrate crystals. So those shiny kind of bits of broken glass that we see in the things that we see in the sediment of red wine, a lot of times in white wines that are intended for early consumption, that's being preempted through cold stabilization. So it's not a thing, but certainly there are white wines that aren't treated that way that will form this. And it has been occasionally problematic for consumers and yet is completely natural. So we already kind of talked a little bit about this, but tannins and pigments together we can refer to them as sort of phenolic compounds, right? And though they're most famously associated with red wine, white wines, it's important, they play an important preserving role in white wines too. And even if, and obviously orange wines, but we're not really talking about orange wines today. In white wines, you can increase the phenolic density of a white wine, even with just brief periods of skin contact and barrel aging, as a barrel can contribute some phenolics as well. In dessert wine, the phenolic compound can be increased through just most of the natural acts of making dessert wine. Anything from dried grapes to freezing, even botrytis can sometimes increase the phenolic density, which helps the ageability of the wine. Of course, on the opposite side of this, some people believe that excessive filtration and fining is the enemy of an age-worthy wine because you're stripping these protections from the wine. So that's not to say that an unfined, unfiltered wine always has the aging advantage over one, but certainly it doesn't help, right? So we talked about this next one about tannin chains. So I'm not gonna go back and revisit that, but I think you understand that that's a complicated and misunderstood and especially mythologized part of the aging process in the greater wine media community. In many cases, the changes that befall aromas over time are the most dramatic. And Dr. Waterhouse, again, please feel to correct me if I'm wrong. But depending on which source you read, sensory scientists estimate that anywhere between 75 to 95% of flavor derives from smell. Right. And that's obviously counterintuitive because we biologically localize flavor to our mouth. Right. If I handed you an ice cream and asked you what flavor it was, you would lick it, right? You wouldn't sniff it. But we smell things this way orthonasally, and then after we swallow them, there's a second smell act, that's a retronasal smell act, and that we're not really consciously aware of. And that those aromas combine with the taste information that we're getting from our tongue, right? Sweet, salty, sour, bitter, umami, and also some textural information. And that creates flavor in the brain, right? So aromas are essential to the way something tastes, okay? Even though I'm using tastes in air quote, not thinking of receptors on the tongue. So any change to the aromatic composition of a wine is going to have a massive impact on the overall sensory impression, right? And what's kind of exciting about that from a wine perspective is wine is probably the most aromatically complex comestible, right? In a given glass of wine, there's anywhere from 100 to 1,000 different aromatic compounds, and some of them are easy to pick out. Others are kind of additive in that they combine to create different, more evocative impressions. But there's all sorts of different kinds of compounds, and I've listed them here: phenols, terpenes, thiols, everything. But the last three, esters, terpenes, and thiols, are often responsible for the smells most associated with youth, things like fruit and flowers, right? And those are the least stable category of aromatic compounds. So that's why fruitiness and florality are often the first kind of aromatic categories to go away as a wine ages, right? And just like with the pigments, where you had both sub pigments dropping out, which revealed existing pigments, and the new ones were being synthesized, the sort of arc of what's going on aromatically is much the same. You have some aromatic compounds that are falling apart, right, are going away. You have that's revealing others that were there but maybe had a lower sensory threshold, and then you have the synthesis of new ones over time, and this can happen through esterification, which we already talked about, oxidation, right, acetaldehyde, that famous like bruised apple smell in Chenin Blanc and other things like in sherry, that happens. That's an oxidative that's create through oxidation. DMS is dimethyl sulfide in like small benevolent doses. That's what smells like black truffle in wines. That's formed after a considerable amount of bottle age through hydrolysis. And so these are things that they're building, right? The other thing that happens, which is really interesting, especially vis-a-vis dessert wine, is that you have more of these primary aromas, let's say, that are not volatile in the beginning of the wine's life because they're still bound to a sugar molecule. And again, even a dry tasting wine inevitably has some sugar molecules in solution. And so these sugar molecules bind to these aromatic compounds. And as the gently acidic medium that is wine wears on that bond over time, those are slowly released. And so you could hypothesize, right, that a wine that is like sort of blessed with more sugar, like a dessert wine, or an abundance of aromatic precursors or aromatic molecules that are bound, would smell more youthful more over a greater period of time, right? This is part of the reason why dessert wines, like think about Sauterne, right, preserve that fruitiness and that florality far longer than dry wines, right? Because they just have more bound aromas that are released on a sort of a more of a slow drip release aromatically. We already talked about this. Sugar is not enough for dessert wine to age well. Almost every dessert wine that is, kind of worth a fig after a decade or more also has an incredible amount of acidity. It's really important, and that comes back to this idea of balance again. And again, not being like a scientific term necessarily. We're not really going to talk too much about balance, but it is fundamental. So it's important to always to keep that in mind. So dessert wines can be some of our longest living wines, both in terms of how well they develop in an unopened bottle, and then also after you open them, kind of how long they stay viable, right? And they have a lot of different advantages, right? For fortified wines, obviously they have that elevated alcohol that's going to keep Acetobacter at bay, and be preservative in that way. They have the high concentration of sugar creates an osmotic pressure that's inhospitable to microbes. Like a small amount of sugar is a buffet for microbes, right? Like that's a great way to make a chemically unstable wine. But a large enough amount of sugar, what happens is that any kind of microbe, bacteria, yeast, whatever, goes in that solution, and they want to create equal pressure. And so what happens is, because there's so much sugar in the solution, the water in the cell of that microbe will leave the cell, effectively bursting the cell to try to equalize the pressure. So it creates, it's the same way that we, make jam out of fresh fruit to preserve it, right? So above a certain level, the amount of sugar becomes a preservative, just like with alcohol. You also have increased phenolic density, which we've already talked about, of dessert wine by virtue of the way that it's made. And then, of course, you have the caramelization that happens, leading to the golden hue. The high concentration of bound aromas over time means a prolonged youthful bouquet. And then the last point is really interesting. So this is something for which maybe Dr. Waterhouse wants to talk about later, but it's something that Dr. Jamie Good has written about a lot, in that a lot of times older dessert wines taste less sweet than younger dessert wines, even if they have the same amount of sugar, right? The amount of sugar hasn't really changed. And the general understanding, or what Jamie Good kind of describes, is that this is more of like a trick, right? Is that as the aromas change to become less youthful over time, right? Less fruity over time, fruity smells, like how often we've all probably interfaced with consumers that will taste a fruity dry wine and say it's too sweet. Right now, it's not sweet at all, but there's a psychological trick that happens when we smell something that we know will taste sweet, like a peach, right? Then we automatically kind of feel like we're tasting something sweet, even if it's dry. So we have a little bit of that mental shift with dessert wine as it ages and it starts to taste less fruity or smell less fruity. It tastes less sweet, even if it's the same amount of sweet, right? So, our own like brains, our own wiring is in the mix here too, in terms of how wines age and how we perceive them. A couple of other considerations, this is probably obvious to everybody, but over time, this same quest to sort of equal pressure in solution and to the atmosphere is what makes sparkling wines slowly lose their bubbles over time. Decanting and dumb phase is really fun to talk about. And I have these here as little footnotes, but honestly, they could probably be full articles in their own, right? Dominic mentioned that my background is as a sommelier. And, one of the things, the great mythologies of being a sommelier is that you have a tight or a tannic red, you want to decant it so that the tannins will smooth out, right? And it takes 2 seconds of talking to a scientist or Googling technical papers to understand that is universally untrue. Like the whole scientific community is like, I think if they could choose one thing other than the tongue map to go away, it would be this idea that decanting a wine like softens the tannins immediately. The amount of time you would need for that wine to be exposed to oxygen to actually affect the texture and the chemical makeup of the tannins and the length of the tannin chains, by the time that happened, the wine would already be spoiled aromatically, right? So that's not really what's happening. And again, like we don't necessarily know what's happening. There's a couple of things that have been put forward that feel right to me, like in Gus Jou's latest book, which is also on Academy du Vin, he talks about this, which feels right, in that a lot of times for old red wines, when we're decanting them, we're taking them from cellar temp and we're introducing them rapidly to oxygen, probably in like a room temp environment. And that sudden like influx of air, while it may not change the tannic structure immediately, it does raise the temperature. And sometimes even just a small degree, small amount of increased temperature, obviously not to the point where things start to feel kind of brutal and whatever, but a little bit can enhance the feeling of flesh. And the other thing that's been put forward is that influx of oxidation can drive a rapid oxidation of off odors, right? That sort of cleans up the nose, right? And that cleaning up of the nose, just like the sort of trick our mind played on us with just old dessert wine to feel like it's less sweet, cleaning up the nose, getting rid of those off flavors, making room for the more fruity aromas to come through, will make us feel like the textural impression of the wine is softer. And none of us want to admit that we're getting tricked by wine, I think, when we taste wine, but the quicker we can come to terms with that, I think the better tasters and communicators that we will all be. And we've already talked about storage. So going a little bit off script from what I had in specifically in Dominic's article, this is from an article I wrote years and years ago about this subject. And I just think that this quote is so beautiful. How do I move everyone's heads so that I can see it? Okay. I just think it's worth reading out loud. So this is a quote from Maggie Harrison, who's the winemaker for Antica Terra and worked for a long time at Sine Qua Non. Sine Qua Non's in California and Antica Terra's in Oregon. And when I asked her, what she thought made a wine age-worthy, she said, quite frankly, she said, if we knew, then everybody would do that thing, right? And instead, what she countered with is that it's less about the physical attributes of the wine and more about the craftsmanship. So this is what she said. Well-made things last. It's the work, not the material. It doesn't matter if it's glass or stone or wood, the Sears Tower or a half-timber house in Norway, a sweater or a book binding. Things that are well-built last a really long time. And so again, like not precisely in the scope of this article or this conversation, but to me, an incredibly meaningful distillation over what I think is important to this. And then again, like when do I know when to drink it? I was trying to Google the Coates, Clive Coates, of course, has like a very famous quote, the Coates principle. I don't want to get this wrong, but I ran out of time to research it. But he feels that it's, I think, the length of time that it took the wine to achieve the sort of like maturity. You have either that much time or maybe even 2x that time to drink it. The point is, I think these old wines are way less fragile than we believe. And, I have had the what I consider to be a huge blessing in the course of my career to have a lot of time interfacing with consumers. And us wine writers, we like to play clairvoyant and assume that we know how long the wine's going to age or, when it's going to achieve maturity and when that maturity is going to drop away. And that's fine. And that's maybe worthwhile communicating because people do appreciate some guidance there. But I have never, ever, ever in my long career of tasting old wine found that any of those predictions were accurate. And that includes the great Michael Broadbent, whom I admire above all others in this particular area. When I was starting as a sommelier at Veritas, I was in my 20s. I hadn't drank 100-year-old Bordeaux before. I had no way of knowing when talking to the guest what it would taste like. And I certainly didn't have the ability to sit down and taste through all the wines we would be serving before starting the job. So you learn as you go. And the way that I would learn, other than talking to my colleagues, was to just run downstairs, pretend I, had to sneeze, run downstairs and flip open Michael Broadbent's tasting notes book and look up these wines. And inevitably, his description would be so perfect and would taste exactly how the wine tasted today. But those tasting notes were, I think, like 20 years old, right? And they had also predicted the wine's demise well by the time I was opening these bottles, and they still tasted the way they tasted to him. So I like to say a wine is not a banana. It's not going to be underripe one day and overripe the next. Like, I think that there is, for me, a lot of consumer anxiety about this idea that a wine has a single peak and that if you miss it, you've lost the game, right? And for me, I think it's important to emphasize, that that's not true, that a wine has many, many, many sort of wonderful drinkable moments over the course of its life. And it's obviously incredibly relative to the person who's drinking it because not everybody likes the same level of autumnal flavors that the rest of us do. So bearing that in mind, I think is important. All right, for now, right now, I'm going to break and just very briefly talk about my approaches to technical writing. And then I'm going to ask Dr. Waterhouse to also touch upon this, and then we'll do Q&A if that's all right. So in terms of being a technical wine writer, again, like I told you, I have a scientific background. I have an interest in this stuff. I like it. But I think that you don't need to have a scientific background to do this well. But it's important, we don't need to over-explain wine to consumers to make them fall in love with it. But I think understanding some of the basics is critical to just being a well-rounded wine professional, right? So one of the questions that I get fielded when mentoring younger writers is like, when do you stop researching, right? Because the sad reality of wine writing is that it doesn't pay very well. And a lot of the services that publishers used to provide in terms of fact checking or even sometimes copy editing, right? They're falling away. And so there's more on the writer's shoulder than ever before, and the compensation in some ways is less than ever before. So how can you justify, when you're a human being with bills and a finite amount of time, how much time and effort to put on this? And I would say, you need to shift your mentality away from, I am doing research for this one article, to I am doing research to improve my understanding of wine, and I can then remonetize this information again and again. So like I said, this is a subject I've written about multiple times, gotten paid each time. This is something that I now have incorporated into my life as an educator, and then I offer like a very, very like low tech version of this under the guise of talking about like to accompany a vertical tasting of something. So it's not at all this technical, but if somebody asks technical questions, I've got this to back me up. And then this is also a foundation, the scientific kind of foundation I've given myself is a springboard to understanding related or adjacent technical topics. So I think investing in a book, like Dr. Waterhouse's, or this book, White Wineology, they might feel, or all of Jamie Good's incredible work, like they might feel dense or not applicable to your job, but I would say it's an investment in yourself, right? It's like education. One of the things that part of the reason why the tongue map is persisting in the wine atmosphere is that people aren't chasing primary sources. I don't think when it comes to technical writing, we're reading things that other people have digested. So if you want to write about the science of wine aging, my advice would be to not read anything that I've written. Right? To go to primary sources, right? To look to find an article that you liked about it. And then if it has footnotes, which I never do because I'm so lazy, but if you find the footnotes, chase those footnotes down and read those, right? And form your own opinion and your own new way of explaining it to your reader. That's really, really, really important. Google Scholar is your friend here, although oftentimes you have to pay for access to those articles, but there are other books and ways to do this, right? Befriend a librarian. I have, my research time has been cut, I don't know, probably to 10% of what it would have been, because I have invested in relationships with librarians and wine libraries. Now, I live in Napa Valley, so I'm really lucky. We've got multiple wine libraries here. UC Davis is probably one of the best ones in the world. And I will call up Axel Borg at UC Davis, archives, and say, like, I'm doing an article on, Dr. Olmo, like, can you point me in some useful directions? It's unbelievable, right? It's unbelievable. Like, digital archives are great. Google search is great, but a human librarian is man's best friend in this particular instance. Same thing with a scientist. Dr. Waterhouse, I'm so touched that he would spend time with us here today. But again, I'm not a scientist. So if you ask me to like dig a little deeper into esterification right now, I would have to refer back to you, go back, do some research and come back, right? And so it's really easy to get this stuff wrong. It's really easy to misunderstand. And that doesn't mean, it's fine. We all have different levels of technical and scientific literacy. But like I said, in my experience, these wine scientists are way more invested than we are in getting rid of misinformation, right? They work really hard at their jobs. They want it well represented. They don't want any more bad information out there. And so they can be very generous, right? There's multiple lion scientists that I email when I feel like I need a little support or just reassurance that I've got something right. And it's absolutely fundamental. And then finally, in terms of like the final communication impression, I always take the extra effort, my poor mom, of having a non-scientist or non-wine person read my work, because if it doesn't make sense to them, you just got to start over. You need to scrap it, because you can write about technical things with non-technical language that is true to the material and still able to penetrate. And that's, I think, the hardest thing to get right. That's the thing that I love. We probably all have like our writing zones that we get this runner's high. That's my runner's high. I like taking really technical things and like funneling it down into something my mom can understand, who's a very smart woman. I'm not trying to like make fun of my mom, but just somebody that is outside of our bubble, I think is really important as we try to expand the audience for wine and wine media. And I'm going to stop sharing now and stop talking. And I'm going to invite Dr. Waterhouse to come and maybe just spend a couple minutes talking about maybe his approach to wine writing, and also weighing in on the state of technical wine writing and wine media at large, whatever you're comfortable with, Dr. Waterhouse, and thank you again.
Wow. I just want to compliment you, Kelly. It's one of the best, I would say, non-technical presentations of aging I've heard. I even learned a new word, plurality. I didn't know that was
I'm not sure that's a word. I'm not sure that's a word.
So what's the state of wine? I mean, I don't know if I can say there's a big changes in wine writing. The one issue I think we always struggle with is wine is complicated. And when I first got to Davis, I heard people talking about we need to make wine more accessible to the uninformed consumer. And there's people who spend their whole careers doing that. But when it gets down to it, it's complicated. There's just no way around it. Like all the places where grapes grow, and why are those places important, and who can remember all those place names? And then the chemistry, the acidity is important, but there's 20 or 50 other things to worry about. So, it's always going to be a challenge. Right now the market's down. So what do we hear? Oh, we have to make wine more accessible to the average consumer. And yes, we do. But we're never going to get to a point where wine is simple and easy to understand. It's just never going to get there. I'll just give one little story because I think it's directly related to wine aging. Many years ago, back in, I think, 2007, 2008, I was chair of the department. We had a new winemaker, and he discovered in the cellar this stash of wine hidden away behind, like, it was cabinets that were sealed with nails and boards and stuff. So you couldn't get, he discovered this by accident. It turns out back there were wines from the 75th anniversary of UC Davis, about 80, 81. The wines were all Cabernet from all regions of California, and they were stashed away, hidden in the cellar. And it turns out they were hidden there for the 100th anniversary of UC Davis, which was coming up in 2008. And I didn't know that, and there were no notes, and we had this cache of incredible wine. So we decided to hold a tasting, which we did. We charged people like $120 a head, which was a hell of a lot of money back then. And they tasted, I think it was 15 or, no, it was more like 20 wines. And there was a little problem, a little glitch, it turned out. I didn't have the authority to do that. The chancellor called me at home. It was a very interesting phone call. I had to get permission and all this. Anyway, we did the tasting. And as you point out, there's bottles, right? So some of the wines, which were famous wines, right, from the 80s, had completely fallen apart. And then there was this wine. So Daryl Cordy ran the tasting, and he had this one wine, which he had no notes on because It was just a cheap wine, cheap Cabernet from the 80s, and it was beautiful, right? So anyway, it was very uneven. Some wines were good, some wines were not. Last year, I was asked to go down to LA to a tasting of the California Vintage Wine Society at this super famous club in the middle of, what was it? I forget the name of the club. Anyway, it is a golf course right in the middle of LA. We did this tasting, and this fellow, John, had stored the wine in his personal cellar from the very day that they were offered. And so they were kept at perfect temperature. And I would say, I was shocked. I thought when he asked me to come down, I said, you better have some backup wines to actually drink. And I think there were only 2 wines of the 20 that were really not, I would say, pleasant to drink. The rest were amazing. So we don't have all the answers. And I think this idea of balance that you mentioned, that, there has to be some acidity, there has to be some alcohol, there has to be some tannin to really make a wine age. That's true. There has to be a balance of that. And we don't know. Us chemists don't know. We don't have a formula to tell you. If you have this formula, it's going to work. We don't. So it still takes, I would say, expertise on the part of people like yourself to be able to predict, is something going to be, good for 10 years or 5 years or 20 or whatever. It's still a mystery. Thank you. I better stop there.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Waterhouse. I really appreciate it. Any questions for either him or I?
Yes, thank you, Kelly. There's a couple of questions here. Becky, Sue, would you like to unmute yourself? Otherwise, I can ask the questions for you. Are you still there? Yep, there you go.
Hi, I just want to say that Kelly helped me out years ago with one of the best received articles I ever wrote for a Chinese wine magazine about older Napa Cabernets and what to serve with them. So, and I think you were at the Napa restaurant and you took me all over. It was into the cellars. I learned so much. Thank you.
Thank you. It's nice to see you again.
So I had a couple of questions, just 2, and then I'll go back off camera. One is, you may have said this, does caramelization of sugar in a dessert wine happen without heat? And the other is anything that precipitates out of old wine harmful to ingest?
Dr. Waterhouse.
Okay, so on the harmful side, no. There's nothing in wine that will be harmful. The crystals that precipitate out is cream of tartar. And the tannin that comes out is innocuous. So don't worry about that at all. And the caramelization, things with lower temperatures, reactions still occur, and caramelization will still occur very slowly. So it's not a lot. And certainly by going to whatever 350 degrees, it'll go much faster. But so it does happen very, very slowly.
Okay, thank you very much. Are there any other questions? I can't see anything else there from anybody. If they'd like to unmute themselves for a quick question, we've got time for maybe one more. Jeff Burrows?
Yeah, I have a quick question. Thanks, Kelly. Traditionally, we hear you need to age your wine consistently 56 degrees, keep it in a cellar. Is there a technical basis for how wine ages at different temperatures? Why is it important to be specifically in that range, not colder, not warmer?
I'll take a stab at this and then hand it over to Dr. Waterhouse for more technical thing. I think the problem we're coming up against with the temperature of wine aging, first of all, lower temperatures are better than higher temperatures because, as we've already sort of discussed, chemical reactions are more slow at lower temperatures, right? So you want to slow down the aging of the wine and all that stuff. But also what we're coming up against is way more anecdotal information than scientific information, because maybe people like Dr. Waterhouse have been putting some scientific effort into that particular area for the last, I don't know, 50 years. Maybe there were even some people studying it beforehand, but we have hundreds of years of collectors having their wine stored underground at cellar temp, which is right around there. So, we have all of this weight that this thing works. And I don't know, and that's meaningful, right? But whether maybe 53 is better than 56 or 57 is better, I don't know that is anything that we understand. But Dr. Waters, please weigh in.
Okay, so this is a topic I do like to talk about. So the history, we have about 250 years of aging wine in glass bottles with corks. Because the combination became technically available in a large enough scale that people started aging wine. Who aged the wine? The people who had bottles of wine to age. It was the producers. Where did they put those bottles? They put the bottles in their cellars. What was the temperature in the cellars? The temperature in the cellar is equivalent to the average annual soil temperature outside the cellar. So the cellar's underground. The temperature is mediated by the soil. So it turns out in two important areas of France, the average annual temperature is around 56 degrees, or it was at least in the 20th century. Okay, now it's going to change. But anyway, so what I'm saying is what we think of as proper cellar temperature cellaring is based on this history, and that's our expectation. Okay, so if we go outside that history, right, which is glass bottle, natural cork, 57 degrees or whatever that was, then we have the wine will age differently. Okay, so we're trapped by our history as a way. Now, it turns out that works well. And if you do age the wine at what we now call room temperature, which would be, say, 70 degrees, it will age differently. And for many wines, it doesn't seem to age as well. So it doesn't meet our expectations. However, I have had wine that I aged in a closet in New Orleans for 5 years. So when I left California to go to New Orleans to teach there, friends gave me a case of wine. I put it in this closet. I didn't have it. There's no cellars in New Orleans. Wasn't willing to air condition the house 24/7. So this wine, while I was at work, my wife and I were at work, we weren't air conditioning the house. So this was like the worst possible, cellaring conditions. But when 5 years came up, I was returning to California. So we had to open all these bottles. Some were not so great. One wine was a Concannon from a particular vineyard, I don't no longer remember, was absolutely fabulous. I mean, it was stunning. And when I got back to California, I found that wine at a shop and bought it, brought it home, popped it open for a special dinner, and we were totally disappointed. It hadn't aged enough, right? So in my crappy cellar and closet in New Orleans, it somehow magically aged properly. So there's no specific secret to the traditional cellaring conditions, but for those wines, they will age gracefully and slowly, and they will turn out better than, I guarantee you, it'll be better than a closet in an unair conditioned closet in New Orleans on average. Okay. But remember, this is a historical fact that this cellaring conditions are defined by those places where they age the wine for 100, 200 years.
There's some, I would say, kind of lusty debate in the cork industry now as to whether it's necessary to age bottles on their side, right? Because we always were told to keep the cork wet so that it would stay flush with the neck. But then the counterpoint is that, well, the humidity is already 100% inside the bottle. So is this even necessary? I don't know. That might be opening up a can of worms unnecessarily at the 11th hour. But these things are in debate, I would say, in this, these questions are being asked.
Okay, let me mention one other thing, which we haven't published, and I don't know if I'll ever get it published. We do have an experiment ongoing. So one thing is that natural cork, and this is key. So natural cork is normally left, the bottles are left on its side. And maybe this is important. Maybe the side being on the side. Because what happens, and I'm sure many of you have had the experience of opening an older bottle and the cork is falling apart. If you're curious enough, and if you can get the cork out intact, I would suggest cut it in half and look and see how much of the cork is actually wet. Okay, so what happens is the cork slowly breaks down and wine gets into the cork itself. When that happens, it dramatically slows the transfer of oxygen into the bottle. So when you have a brand new cork, a brand new bottle, it transfers about 1 milligram of oxygen into the bottle every year. Now, if that continued continuously, pretty much no wines would last more than 20 years. But what happens is the wetting of the cork actually brings that water inside the cork slows the transfer of oxygen through the cork to about 1/10, maybe less. Where this is one of the things we're actually running an experiment on. And we've pulled bottles apart. We've taken 10-year-old bottles and cut the neck off and then measured the amount of oxygen going through that cork. And it turns out to be about 1/10 as much as it was on day one. And so that's one of the reasons the wine can last for many, many years is the cork actually slows the oxygen coming in.
It's fabulous. I hope you do publish that.
I have a
That
question.
was absolutely brilliant, Kelly and Dr. Waterhouse. Thank you so much. We've learnt a huge amount about the science, but what I love still is that there is still mystery involved. The questions haven't all been answered. So please, please keep up the good work, keep spreading true information, and we'll wait for more. Thank you again very, very much.